Do you remember when we were in college that a mutual friend, because we did go to college together.
That's right.
That there was an epic prank that a member of the Swarthmore College Computer Society played once, where he made a list of like 30 words that were associated with like postmodernism and post-structuralism, like deconstruct or like Derrida or I don't know, logocentrism or the phallus. And he hacked into the Swarthmore printing system so that every single thing that came out of the college printers was missing those words, which I just thought was, I don't think it's cancellation. Perhaps he was actually just putting things under erasure in an incredible way. But I was like, I know that this book is definitely not telling us to be nostalgic for like the days of yore on the college campus. What a kinder, gentler.
That's right. We just literally, we had a literal list of words you couldn't print.
Yeah.
You couldn't say in print.
Yep. Not fit to print.
Nope. At least not, at the group printers in, where was that? I forget where the computer lab was, but, certainly not in.
That was when there were computer labs.
God, where were they? How did we print anything?
We went to the library. We went to the library, Adrian.
So did he hack like the PostScript files or like
I don't
was this
know.
on?
I'm
like
a humanities person.
Okay.
I just remember the outcome.
You're making me think here of that other type of cancellation that we don't do anywhere near enough of anymore. What's the like? It's damnatio memoriae, right? It's when when they strike the name of like the pharaoh or the botched emperor or whatever from the obelisk, and you literally can know it's just a hole there. And I feel like none of the people who get canceled seem to go away. Like cancellation seems to be a way to get more rather than less inscription in the public record.
As far as, someone just getting completely, it's this fantasy of disappearance, but really it's much more the return of the repressed. It's, the proverbial turd that won't flush. The
ultimate horror, of course, is if the flushing doesn't work, if objects return.
I will say, one of the funny things is for a project that didn't end up making it into the book, I looked at different Wikipedia pages and on cancel culture in various languages. And there's one where they're like, cancel culture is kind of like the damnatio memoriae. And then another where it's like, cancel culture is different from the damnatio memoriae. I'm like, okay, so I really feel like we're operating with an admirable degree of sharpness here, where like, forget what it was. It was like Serbian is like, yep. And Italian is like, no, it's different, or the other way around. I forget exactly how it worked, but it's very, very funny to sort of have two that are like, nope, it's different, or yeah, it's the same.
That was one of the things I really appreciated about the book from the outset is like, you're working so hard to pin this thing down, which turns out to be like, and it just like skitters away.
Yeah.
Like time after time after time, which of course is, extraordinarily like revelatory about like what the nature of this object is. But, I'm trying to think of other terms that made their way so quickly from like the discourse into, I don't know, even like my classroom. Like I remember like it went from like 1 year where no one said the word canceled to like 50 students being like, excuse me, I'd like to write a paper on Kant and cancel culture. And I was like, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Like Kant, yes. But the rest of this.
Categorically forbid them.
You were far more disciplined than most editors in continental Europe who would have been like, well, we'll print 20 of them.
I didn't want to read it. I was like, that's not real. I mean, I was just like, that's not real.
Yeah, the Kant, you mean? Yeah, no, he's definitely made up.
No, yeah.
But you're right. It is this. It's this interesting duality, right? Where on the one hand you have people have this incredibly sharp sense of precise definition and think they're being very, very analytical and using it. And then you, as you say, like you try to pin it down. You're like, what the fuck is even happening, right? And it's that aspect of it that, like, they're all these things that we can sort of like say, like, well, none of us really know what that is. Like identity politics, right? Like a little hard to pin down. But then people sort of will sort of recognize that in their own usage. But this is one where people really, I mean, one of the things I have now found in 2 languages, people will yell at me for being like, I have a perfect example of this, and I have a perfect, I have a perfect definition of it. And I'm like, well, let's hear it. And they're like, then they come out with this thing that, like, frankly, 50% of the famous cases like don't apply. And I'm like, well, feels like, you've made your own nest here. You have your own little bauble, but like, honestly, what other people out there are talking about is very, very different. And it is this weird duality between absolute self-certainty and the slipperiness that really I think my bedevilment, my frustration with it, I think shines through in the book, that I'm like, what the fuck is this?
And yet you do track it admirably. You sort of, you're on its trail as it kind of traverses these both linguistic and geographical boundaries, but also shows all the signs of being a kind of, on the one hand, this protean mobile thing, but on the other hand, a legible symptomatic expression of a series of libidinal and like material anxieties that all too often result in, and I think you used the word a couple times, and the word is, I think, entirely appropriate, like a hystericization on the part of the people sort of doing it, that where the people bemoaning it, that will move from, on the one hand, these sort of abstract discussions. Well, we all know what we're talking about. Come on, you've encountered it too, right? And then the to anecdata, right, or to completely sort of spurious kind of like folktale, and then before you know it, we'll wind up in the camps, which is always the thing that I've sort of found a little bit like the slippery slopeness of it, right? That there's this sort of dance between the universal and the particular, between like the totally quotidian and the banal, like, oh, this is this thing that got you called into HR too. And I guess what I'm thinking, the rebus I'm thinking of here actually is a sort of singular breakdown that happened on TV during the 2020's primary. Do you recall this, when Chris Matthews was like,
oh yeah,
was processing incoming results?
I remember it because you brought you so much joy.
It was like Sanders was doing better than expected in some preliminary polling bullshit, right? Obviously we know how this ended, right? But Chris Matthews live on TV starts suddenly talking about how, well, God, I feel so, it almost feels cruel to say, but like invoking Vichy France and stories of generals being like, we've fallen, there's nothing to happen, it's a matter of time before the executions start happening on on like Bowling Green or whatever. And like, it was literally like reading in the possibility of, again, like both like Bernie, but also the youth behind Bernie in this way. Like they could become a container for what was previously just this sort of tag, namely the propensity of culture to be canceling people, that now suddenly we were in an apocalyptic scenario.
Yeah. I mean, 2 things that really struck me. I mean, the book is a study of a signifier. It's a word that makes it around the globe, and it doesn't always mean the same thing, but it gets sort of adapted and adjusted. And as you say, it ends up, it's really its function for certain people, and the rules of its use that for me gave me a little bit of clarity as to what this thing was and how it was really working. That is to say, it was very clear to me that there were rules for what was cancel culture and what wasn't, even if the definitions themselves didn't work that well. And especially what wasn't cancel culture, right? There are certain people who really can't cancel someone. And there are certain people who, can do things that very much look like cancel culture, but it isn't that, it's combating it, right? And then the other part of it is that even though these rules kind of kept getting renegotiated in different countries, there was a kind of canon attached to them, right? The cases that always come up, the books that you're no longer allowed to teach, allegedly, the kind of associated words that sort of, again, can be different from country to country, but there is a kind of catalog of other words that people sort of attach to it.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing to me was that through that, you can actually sort of show the kind of political work it does much better than if you sort of assume that everyone is drawing on a shared set of examples and a shared definition. It's functionally very, very analogous from a place like France to the United States to Switzerland to the UK. Even though people might be picturing something very, very different when they say it.
listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am so happy for so many reasons to introduce Adrian Daub. Adrian is an academic and writer living in San Francisco. He teaches at Stanford University, where he directs the Clayman Institute for Gender Research. Before the cancel culture panic, his most recent book for a general audience was What Tech Calls Thinking, which came out with FSG in 2020. His essays and criticism have appeared in The New Republic, The Nation, N+1, Time, The Guardian, and many, many German and Swiss magazines and newspapers. Adrian also co-hosts the fantastic podcast In Bed with the Right with Moira Donegan, a podcast that is about conservative ideas about sex and gender and how they continue to fuck up our lives. Adrian, it is such a delight to have you here. I should also say, by way, I don't always get to do a personal introduction, but I've actually known Adrian since college. We went to college together.
That's right.
I have to tell you that you are one of the people that live in my brain in that, like, subject supposed to know kind of way. Like, truly, like, at some point in life, you're like, there aren't people that know all the answers, but like you're in my like personal pantheon of like people who I do believe actually have all the answers. So we were also afraid of you in seminar, and
well, I lived in fear of you. I feel the exact same way. Yeah, I feel like, especially when it came to French thought and religious thought, I just kind of I would always sort of glance over at you and be like, "Oh my God, is she going to react?" And if you flinched, I was like, "Oh no, this is probably wrong. I'm just going to shut up now." I feel like my subject supposed to know was just that I knew German. I feel like that's the only thing I was trading on.
It was a non-trivial thing, but I also, I had this. I have a memory also of running into you like in the middle of the night sometime on campus, and you just started talking about Lacan. It was like 2 a.m. I was like, his brain is never going off. Anyway, that is so clear in your output, in your writing and teaching and podcasting, and I'm just really delighted to have you here. The book is wonderful, and I'm so excited to get into it.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a huge fan of the podcast. I love learning about the standard edition and rereading some texts that I have been teaching for decades and others that I completely missed. And it's just so wonderful. I never got to take any of the classes that you both did at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. And now I feel like, thanks to the magic of podcasting that we all owe so much to, I get to, and I'm really, really excited to be on today.
Can I ask, just as a completely interjecting?
Yeah, sure.
Hang on, I don't want to. This may be too precious for some of the audience, and I don't want to do like podcasters talk podcasting. Though, is there a podcast out there that's just like podcasters review other podcasts? Because that would
my God,
that would be so cool, or just like so perverse. But what I'm thinking about the imperversity element of cancellation, or like the one of the things that you get into in the text is so sort of profoundly is like one of these, the underlying conditions of anxiety that produces this as a symptom, or at least the way in which the complaint of cancelability bears a kind of uncanny warped resemblance to the real, is like this idea of how we are, as you put it, like celebrity exists on this kind of infinite and somewhat contingent spectrum where we could all do anything and just get, well, our post could ruin us, right? I think Shoshana Zuboff calls it an archive of ruin, right? Do you ever have, just as a podcaster, just like the imp of perversity, right? Where it's just like I think about kind of the way like the narrator in Moby Dick begins with being like, well, I have a pistol in my drawer just in case, right? Do you ever have this moment where you just like want to do something to get canceled and just be done with it? Or just like either you're haunted by the fear of getting canceled, or do you ever just like the appel du vide here, right? Do you ever just want to leap into it? And if so, what would you do?
It's a good question. I think for me as a podcaster, I don't. I know the imp of the perverse that you speak of from Twitter, where you're like, you can sort of think there's a platonic ideal of the worst possible response you could have for this particular tweet. And you're like, it would be fucking funny.
Yeah.
and I should get fired for it. Not just like would, but should, right? You'd be like, well, that's pretty fair. The funny thing is that with podcasting, I don't think I feel that way. For a very simple reason, and I think it cuts actually to the center, to the core of the phenomenon we're talking about, which is that I find that it's a very forgiving medium, and that there is a kind of what Marcuse would call repressive tolerance to it. That is to say, I might say it, and then nothing happens. And in some way, that is the greater horror, right? That I that I say the offensive thing, and I was like, well, kind of weird, right? And I'm like, what more must I do? Which rooftop shall I scream this from in order to get effectively canceled, right? There's a kind of like, some of cancel culture is about like the horror of resonance, of your words having resonance.
Yeah.
And some of it is about the mounting horror of lack of resonance. The fact that we really say our thing and everyone's like, doesn't give a shit, right? I mean, especially that's why humanists get so like incensed about this. It's our fantasy. Like, we'd love to have resonance, but ultimately people are like, oh, it's not nice for you. Go read some texts, you little dumbass, like just run off, right? And we all secretly know that that's who we are. And so I think in podcast land, I don't have this at all. I think my fear is the opposite, that I might never get to have a cancelable opinion out there.
There is that kind of like, I talk about imps of the perverse or perversity all the way down, that kind of like desire to matter that being canceled would kind of fulfill, right? Like it reminds me of like talk about another thing that exports across cultural or geographic like divides, but that probably also doesn't translate. But I'm thinking about the uncle you only ever see on Thanksgiving and who just wants to trigger you so he can get disinvited, right? There's something about the like, please cancel me. Please, you young Zoomers with your vapes and whatever it is you've got going, just kill me, please. Like it's like a suicide by big other fantasy in some way that seems to bespeak almost like a loneliness at that level. Forgive me again. I'm just sort of thinking about this in a grim way.
No, I think you're right. I mean, there is, and especially when we talk about academic cancellation, that is one of the appeals of this narrative. It allows the tiny cuts that our narcissism receives inevitably while being on a university campus that most people couldn't give less of a shit about. It allows us to make those into a big generational drama, right? My students no longer understand me. It makes it into a First Amendment issue. It makes it into an issue of academic freedom, which it very well may be, but it also does kind of flatter our inner narcissism. There's a case, I don't want to get this wrong, but I think it was Alan Gribben at the University of Texas. He was sort of like held out as a victim of political correctness in the late 80s, 90s. And there are a couple of articles that talk about sort of what had happened to him. And like, he claims he basically got canceled, right? Like he doesn't use that word, but he basically got canceled for objecting to the number of texts by African Americans in the shared curriculum that they were teaching in the English department. And the infractions that he talks about are like, a Black colleague was rude to me at the copy machine. And like, there was a holiday gathering I was not invited to. And you're like, oh, wow. Like this is a moment where someone whose the world is changing around him. And this is a way for him to get a national newspaper to talk about the fact that someone was mean to him at the Xerox machine. Like that is kind of amazing, right? Like, and it's hard not to think of that as like one of the motivations of these kinds of stories. It allows you to blow up the absolute like minutiae of academic life to this kind of titanic scale, and to get people to care about it. And it's not shocking to me that academics really fall for that lure maybe more readily than people in the press, right? Who have different ways to get their own narcissism out. Like this is for us sort of the moment when we get to shine and matter again in a world in which we seem to shine and matter so little.
I feel like we could like continue to riff for the entirety of this show. So I'm gonna assert a little bit of order.
Please.
Because the book is just newly out. Well, at least it's newly out in English. And I wanted to do a little ground clearing first to make sure that our listeners have a sense of the scope of the book before we get a little bit more granular. So The cancel culture panic was first published in German in 2022, and it has just come out in America. Can you tell us a little bit about how this book in its multiple incarnations came into being, and just sketch out for our listeners a few of the main lines of thinking, including this central claim that what we call cancel culture is fundamentally a continuation of the discourse of political correctness. And before I end that already very long question, let me also say that I'm hoping you might say a couple of words too about your methodology in the book here, which I found really fascinating. It so clearly reflects your training in comparative literature, and it involves a sort of symptomatic literary reading of text from polemics to campus novels to op-eds, in a whole host of languages. So yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah. Let me take those in order, maybe. So
Sure.
the question of the origins. I find that there are usually multiple reasons I end up writing a book, and some of them only emerge sort of during the writing.
Yeah.
But one big one for this one was definitely, right, I argue in the book that cancel culture is a concept that's both interesting and problematic. And part of that is that the cancel culture panic comes to us not sort of medium independent, but rather through a specific genre of text. The kind of text that we've already alluded to a little bit in the cold open, right? Has to have hyperbolic historic comparisons. It has to have anecdotes that you kind of feel like probably didn't happen quite this way. Has to postulate that things are getting worse. Has to kind of contain this caricature of mostly left-wing young college students. Has to center on certain fields and not on others, frankly, right? It's often about the humanities and not about the social sciences or especially not the natural sciences. So, right, like it lives and moves through a very specific set of texts, usually in print media. And this is even more true the further you move away from the actual supposed hotbeds of cancel culture. That is to say, the internet and the campus and the United States. Basically, the moment you move to Europe, you get even more sort of like woodcut-like stories of what's happening on American campuses and stuff like that. And that is honestly where I first encountered these questions and became interested in them, in the simple sense that I was asked to write these texts. People were like, write about your students and how you're scared of them. And I'm like, well, not really. I don't know how to write that. Write to us about trigger warnings and what that says about freedom of speech. I'm like, not sure it says anything, And so what emerged to me very clearly were two things, right? One was there was a particular kind of text that they were asking for and that the readership clearly wanted, right? These are not editors who were doing this out of some kind of necessarily ideological conviction. They were doing it because these texts tended to go well when they hit the social networks or when they were in their newspapers. And the second thing I noticed was that they seemed to know the answers better than I did, right? I found it very hard to generalize about what students were like. This was a time when I was teaching upwards of 1,000 students a year, or maybe just under that. And
Oof.
I was like, how would I know what's true of all these kids, right? Like I've met some kids who are like this and some kids who are like that, right? And Stanford students, I think, are not as diverse as some other schools, right? I mean, like I would imagine that your average community college draws a far broader swath of the American populace than Stanford, right? But they had this clarity. They knew kind of what they were looking for. They knew what the college campus was like. And I was like, well, that's curious because I'm there every day for my sins. What is it that gives them this clarity that I cannot possibly muster? And so that was the origin of the book for me. And in terms of the argument, I think I've already kind of mentioned it a little bit. It is that, right, cancel culture is a reboot of political correctness, specifically in the way it marshals anecdotes, specifically in the way it talks about it sort of relies on data that really cannot be either verified or falsified. And it is a reboot in reaction, I argue in the book, to Me Too and Black Lives Matter, right? It's also a panic, and I've already alluded to that as well, aimed at readers of legacy media, at readers looking to be informed, at pretty educated consumers, right? This is not a panic that addresses itself to people with low information. I get challenged about this book all the time. And one thing I have to say, these people are very well informed. I think they're not informed particularly well, or they're not being given very good information,
right?
But they have certainly accumulated a lot of it, right? The number of people who know, 20, 30 proper names they can rattle off. I'm like, Jesus Christ, like where do you find all this stuff, right? And then the third thing is that the cancel culture panic is expressive of a moment at which a self-conceived liberalism and centrism in truth is starting to build bridges, especially when it comes to cultural politics, towards the far right. So that's kind of the punchline of the book, that this is that people who may not agree with Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis on many things can agree with him on the college campus. That people who themselves, hate Marine Le Pen might be able to speak her language, or Giorgia Meloni when it comes to left-wing cancel culture. That people in Germany who would never vote for the AfD may sort of be able to make a home for themselves in a world where the AfD is very, very strong, if not dominant, through these kinds of culture war issues. So that's kind of the argument. In terms of the method, it really is about, as you say, textual analysis and through these genres. I tried to figure out how many of these are there. I can't say how many cases of cancellations there are because it's hard to say what is a cancellation, right? What I can say is how many articles there were in a given newspaper in a given frame of time, right? Is it more or less? Which sections of the newspapers is it in? How many anecdotes do they have, right? These are the kinds of things you can quantify. And so I did try to do a little bit of big data, as they say, and try to kind of look through these large textual corpora and sort of try and figure out who is the imagined reader? What does that reader think they're getting out of these texts? What counts as information in this kind of ecosystem? That was sort of my overall method in putting together the book.
I really want to linger on something that I think just came up, and I want to point out to our listeners that it's not just because we're all academics that we're talking so much here about academia and journalism. I'm hoping that before we even really get more granular about like definitions and like what is cancel culture and what is this term that's going to be really important, the moral panic, I want to talk about this very interesting feature of your book, which is that it spends so much time thinking about the American college campus. And I want to be really clear, as you are really clear in the book, that this isn't the quote unquote real campus, right? It's not anything that approximates the college experience that most Americans have. You call it instead the imagined campus. And it's this kind of fantasy space, right? This site of all sorts of proxy battles and projections. And, kind of sidebar, I loved your conversation recently on In Bed with the Right with Samuel Catlin, whose piece, I think that came out like just after the book.
Right after this went to print, I was like, why would you do this to me? This is such a great piece, and it dovetails so beautifully with my argument.
Yes. So the piece, Samuel Catlin's piece, which you should all read alongside Adrian's book, The Campus Does Not Exist. And you should also listen to Adrian and Moira talk to him about it on In Bed with the Right. But it is so much about this imagined campus. And I want to ask you why it's so important for us to understand the preoccupation with the imagined campus, why it's so central to the cancel culture panic, and what are some of the various ways in which the narratives about that campus feature in that panic. And, maybe put a little bit differently and using language that I think I'm not putting in your mouth, that is, quite clearly there in the book. What is it about this specific vision of the American college campus that has made it such a powerful site for projection and fantasy?
I mean, it's a great question. I think first, it's important to note, as you do, that it's just an empirical fact that this panic starts being about anything but the campus, right? The word comes out of fan cultures online. It sort of becomes important in the immediate wake of Me Too, meaning it's really more about entertainment and fandom than it is about the academia. And then it takes about a year before it basically just gets into the old groove and is like, what are college students up to, right? Like with their trigger warnings and their safe spaces. Like, are they doing cancel culture? And suddenly you can you can barely get anything else in, right? Like, so it is just like, it's just demonstrable that more and more sort of campus stories become central to this. And this is what I mean by when I say that it is a rehash or a return of the political correctness panic. Now, why the campus? I'll give maybe 3 reasons. One is that the campus, sort of in that in Samuel Catlin's sense, right, like the hyper object campus,
right,
is a place that's become politicized in the popular imagination. We're told that campus stories matter, that they're politically salient, even when how they are supposed to be that is really kind of unclear, right? Even as college students are fairly marginal political actors, we're told that their particular contestations and contretemps are basically indicative of where we are as a society, right? And of course, as Samuel points out in his brilliant piece, the campus imagined here usually is like 8 campuses, right? Like there are over 5,000 in the United States. That's not what people mean, right? They mean Yale, Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, right? Berkeley is always a good one. And then a couple of Swarthmore is probably in there, right? Like we're always good for some kooky thing or other that we've done.
Oberlin.
Oh yeah, gotta have Oberlin because of the, if for nothing else, for the sandwiches. That's the first reason, right? Like it's become politicized. What we're told that what happens there matters to us and should inform our voting behavior and the way we look at the world. The second point is it is an object that has been, and this is something that Samuel, I think, doesn't talk quite as much about in the piece on the campus does not exist. It's been constructed by crossing fiction and reportage. It's a place where the novels about it, right, our big campus literature can feel very real. I have a piece in the book where I show a little bit how Philip Roth's The Human Stain sort of keeps getting reintroduced as like a piece of evidence of cancel culture. And you think, first of all, it's a novel. Second of all, it's 20 years old.
That's not a real professor.
Right? I'm like, look, I'm as literary as they come. And I'm like, does it not matter that this didn't happen? That this person is made up by a guy? I feel like that matters. I feel like I should get kicked out of my field for this, but I just
it's okay. We'll allow 10.
I'm just shocked, right?
And this is how you finally get canceled, Adrian, is by saying that fictional characters aren't real.
Yeah, you heard it here first, folks. But it's also where reality can feel quite novelistic, right? Like where people sort of show up and we meet these heroes, right? There's a passage in Dinesh D'Souza's Illiberal Education from 1991 where he starts a campus anecdote from Harvard with the quote with the famous opening line from Kafka, right? Someone must have been spreading lies about Joseph K. because without having done anything wrong one day, he was one day arrested, right? When we are presented with real people, this is a story about Stephen Thernstrom, who was perfectly real.
Yeah.
They come in a literary guise and we're asked to relate to them almost as literary characters. So that's the second reason. It's a place where it almost doesn't matter what's real and what's fiction, what's reportage and what's genre, right? And where we've kind of become comfortable in that gray area, right? And then finally, the campus is a place, and I think this is frankly why, on a very pragmatic level, why the cancel culture panic found its way back to the campus, where there is a large infrastructure out there producing and collecting these anecdotes. That is to say, one reason why I think media dropped out of the picture again is because media doesn't like talking about itself. But the New York Times evidently has as Claudine Gay found out, right, has 20 writers ready to hop the Acela to Boston and walk around campus and capture what undergraduates say, right? Our national newspapers are deeply fixated on these stories, and there is an infrastructure for how to report on them and for who reports on them. Meanwhile, right, there are conservative foundations that already spend inordinate amounts of money kind of campus watching, right? Like whether they're called Campus Watch or whatever they are, right? This has been around. This is the Olin Foundation. This is, heritage.
My building at my office on campus is Olin.
Nice.
Ammunition makers, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that there is a accuracy in academia is another one of these, Les Sorba's outfit. And so we've had for something like going on 60 years now, this infrastructure largely funded by right-wing cranks that kind of overanalyzes tiny sort of campus anecdotes and knows how to sort of get other people to care about them. And I think that is ultimately why journalism found its way back to the campus, because it's easier to write those kinds of stories. This is also kind of a story of a dying media ecosystem where people just have to write way more copy. And it's just like, well, we have this awesome anecdote. What if, fuck it. We'll just like pack that in, compare it to, the Cultural Revolution or to, I don't know, Robespierre. And then we can just like be done with this bad boy and go to sleep, right? Yeah. And so that's the other part of it, that we have kind of a very, very material basis for this panic, which is kind of this infrastructure that's not just conservative foundations, but was really started by them, that kind of has learned to pay attention to the campus as a pretty cheap and easy place to get stories that'll get the blood boiling and that don't require that much fact checking and that, will get readers.
There's so much in what you're saying, and I think it tracks on so many levels with what's been, at least is my experience as someone who's done journalistic work in addition to being on campuses, where there is this, well, from the way in which, and I forget the specifically pithy way I've had editors put this to me, and generally when they do this they're making fun of it, but the whole idea is that like, well, one instance, okay, two instance, fine. Get me three instances of something, it's a trend and you've got a piece, right?
Yeah.
Which on the one hand, yes, you do need three examples of something. That's like those are the middle three paragraphs of a nice 5-paragraph essay, if you want to look at it that way. On another hand, it's like, I've got a vibe out there. I feel like there's a vibe out there. Or better yet, and honestly, this is the other part of it and gets directly to these institutional feeding mechanisms. I just got an email from Campus Reform, right? Or one of whoever is the latest person named Connor, Noah, Chad, whatever, who is, has graduated from this institution, but still maintains connections to to the student paper or to the Campus Republicans or to the Debate Association or whatever. They're still jacked in with people who want to intern with them, and they can give us the story and also have the experience of going back there. And it on the one hand, it makes perfect sense insofar as like, well, yeah, a lot of those institutions that we just named are the feeders into elite journalism.
Right.
And it would make sense that there would be concerns about changes in the complexion or disposition of your newsroom trickling down into coverage of the campuses. But also, like, there is the narcissism of small differences between increasingly precaritized neoliberal sort of like gig workers, like knowledge gatekeepers, like competing for real estate space on the op-ed pages or otherwise. And I think this is the other element that really kind of speaks to the dense sort of overdetermined layerings of both libidinal and political economies here. Like, there is this way in which, as you were describing it, it's not just that the campus is the place where all these stories are sort of given to us from, like, the sad professor, right? Who, and I didn't even make this connection until I saw you connected this bit in your book. You're like, all these examples from Philip Roth to Coetzee to whatever, like these professors always do the one thing that their real life canceled that like right-wing analogs never do. Or rather always do, is like they just drink and go away, whereas the people in the real world seek legal counsel and never leave. But like it's also the fact that it's not just that we have those tropes and those stories. There's a way in which I think, particularly for people who are invested in the knowledge professions or in thinking that like discourse is where stuff happens, which is, I think what a lot of journalists at certain higher levels also think, college is where you first test out that hypothesis, where you first like encounter that persona as a type for yourself to become, but also like, it's like where you write your own Bildungsroman on, right? It's like where you're supposed to come into your own. And I think that finds mirroring in one last thing. And if you don't mind, read this from your own book, this lovely bit that you are describing about sort of the intra-familial and intergenerational dynamics of what college campus sort of scenarios are like. And it's the most important contact that people of a certain age have with universities is when they drop their offspring off on campus and over the next 4 years have to watch their dear child grow into a full-blown adult. It's not always a pleasant process. It's deeply eerie and certainly also depressing for parents. In this scenario, the moral concerns associated with the traditions of the campus narrative coincide with a widely shared emotional experience. The fact that adult readers think they understand the campus better than they do, in fact, likely draws its power from another relationship. Many of those adults have children who have begun to strike out on their own, and they are perhaps torn between the feeling that they know better than those children and the sense that they no longer understand them at all. And I think it's hard not to feel, I'm stipulating all the predatory work of these sort of institutions that are working to,
you mean Campus Watch and so forth.
Yeah, to essentially like blow up kids' careers and that will set and ruin the careers of academics, et cetera. Like there is a poignancy to that aspect of it, like this idea somehow that the kids are, we don't know if they're okay, we don't know if they're not okay, but they're doing something different. We're probably paying for it, possibly.
Right. One way or another.
They don't seem to be enjoying it as much, or they're unhappy about some things, or they're metabolizing some things in ways that we aren't quite capable of metabolizing. And that gets compounded with all these kind of nostalgias and regrets. And it's hard not to, at the same, even as I have contempt for them, to think about some of those be journalists. I think like some of those Andrew Sullivan pieces, like he's what, like 60 something now, where he's like talking about his experience of what college kids are telling him at event. And I'm like, dude, are you like hanging out with college kids? Like, and like trying to impress them with how you used to own kids with affirmative action bake sales. Like it feels so personal and yet so generic at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, and part of it is also that, right. You mentioned that, a lot of this is the logic of the Bildungsroman, and like, it never is fun to be in someone else's Bildungsroman. And I think that is the fundamental melancholy, both of the college parent and of the college instructor, right? You are, if you do your job well, not the main character anymore. And, it is learning to die in some small fashion. And like, I mean, like, I think it comes through in passages like that I don't not understand that impulse. I think that there's something deeply human and sad about them. It's also, frankly, why the college campus has been so fruitful for literature, right? Yeah. It becomes this laboratory where you can very easily ask people about, obsolescence, about the passage of time, about the meaning of professional life in ways that it's become harder to do in other parts of American life, I think. But it does mean that we in some way look to the college campus to negotiate for us, a place where we negotiate sort of as a stand-in questions that really it's not been constructed to answer, and that really we're kind of freighting it and freighting our own kids with these big questions to which we think we already know the answers in some cases. And the one thing we're not letting them do is kind of their own thing and say it means what it means. It's not for us to already know the interpretation of these incidents, of these language games, of these changes in terminology, et cetera, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so easy in some ways for all of the reasons that you're adducing here about why the campus is such a fertile site for the novel, but it's so easy, I think, to fall into this kind of like tidy opposition between like the institution of like the family, as like the site that is supposed to be doing the reproduction of knowledge, and then the university, the campus where all of that, those 18 years worth of that could just be undone. In a moment. And, one of the things I love about the book, and, I felt in some ways that I was even more prepared for it by listening to In Bed with the Right and also Know Your Enemy, is like you take us on this tour along the way. I'm not thinking about the campus novel section here. I'm thinking about
the neocons.
Basically. Yeah. I'm thinking about Alan Bloom's, I'm thinking about The Closing of the American Mind. I'm thinking about, Buckley, right, about God and Man at Yale, and the ways in which these completely opposed arguments about the problem with the university somehow still kind of manage to, persist in various conservative imaginations, and, are the way that those legacies are really clear in these anecdotes that, as you say, circulate and get repeated. And in the case of what's the name of the professors? It started with TH that
Thernstrom.
Thernstrom,
yeah.
Where, the story bears such a, just remarkably tangential relationship to any of the facts of the case. And the way I also was thinking, because, my pedagogical brain never stops. Like, I was like, man, Adrian's book is such a good illustration of like, what can the humanities show you?
Right.
Do you know what I mean? The ways that, that there can be so few points of contact with reality. Oh, that's what it was. It was the way that D'Souza starts this book with like the quotation from Kafka. And it's like, this professor knew exactly what happened because the students came and talked to him. And the whole point of the anecdote, as you're, talking about it in the book, is he never knew. He was left in ignorance. And it's like, not just, again, I'm not like you. I'm not someone that is going to rigidly insist on the distinction between the fictive and the real, but it strikes me as a fairly meaningful distinction.
In that case, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and precisely because it does the fictive move does a bunch of stuff, right? It eclipses the communitarian aspect, right? If you drill down into any of these campus controversies, but of course, what you find are these are people who've known each other for decades, and there are layers and layers of resentment. And then you put students into that combustible mix, and that's what you're really getting.
Yeah.
That all drops out. And I mean, I get that. I mean, you can't re-narrate a 20-year enmity. Like that's ain't nobody gonna read that shit.
Well, I mean, you can, but that's just called a faculty meeting.
Right,
Those are the minutes of a faculty meeting.
No, I have literally reacted to like stories like, well, the bad blood about them is about them. Like, let me stop you right there. Like, this is like, I'm a tenured professor, and like that is too much rich for my blood. Like, I genuinely, like, what is that famous meme? I ain't reading all that.
Yeah.
I'm happy for you though. Sorry that happened. Right.
Yeah.
Like, I'm just gonna.
Can I just interject here that the fact that you dispense with the Jane Gallup feminist accused of sexual harassment with literally 3 sentences.
Thank you. I mean, I have to say that it was longer in the German version. I walked people through it because it was just astonishing to me that, like, on the one hand, obviously I'm all for theorizing things that happen to us. I think that's not the stupidest response to something, but the fact that throughout all this, it didn't seem to occur to her that, like, she was holding the mic the entire time.
The whole time.
That struck me as like, well, this is a smart and thoughtful reader of texts and people. And something about this language game occluded that fundamental truth to her. And that strikes me as really dangerous, right? Like, in the hands of someone who's not as perceptive, it's a real problem.
Yeah. Adrian, one of the other terms that we haven't really gotten to yet, but that's really fundamental for the book, is the idea of moral panic. And I have to confess, I had always associated that with Gail Rubin. And I did not know the origin story that you talk about in the cancel culture panic. So I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit about the origins of that term and why you frame cancel culture as a kind of species of moral panic.
Yeah. So I take that term from the sociologist Stanley Cohen, who wrote a book with that title, basically in the 1970s. And he's analyzing the mod rocker panic of the 1960s, which sort of I had to look up what the fuck that was. But he does a really good job of walking you through these apocalyptic pronouncements that were made basically on the basis of a few young people who did gel their hair a certain way and people who didn't, and people who did wear leather jackets and who didn't, kind of getting into fisticuffs, right? Like it's a really kind of, it's watching him sort of trace this mode of escalation, which I think moral panic really is, really was very, very clarifying to me of what was happening in both the political correctness panic and the cancel culture panic, which is to say, they start with a real thing. Moral panics are usually not fully invented. I mean, the satanic panic of the 80s is the one everyone thinks of, and that is just invented out of whole cloth, it seems to me. But most of them aren't, right? Heavy metal fans did commit suicide, right? Like there are gangs in the inner city, right? Like what happens is the question of the moral panic is really what happens when what Cohen calls moral entrepreneurs get a hold of this. When you don't ask, well, let's talk to some heavy metal fans and find out what they think of this, but instead you get like a sheriff explaining to you, how big a problem this is. You have like the cult cop who's going to explain to you how to spot whether your kid's in a cult. You get, the member of parliament who's like, something must be done about this. You have the concerned parent who's like, I haven't talked to my child about this, but I'm fairly confident it's this, right? And this kind of move away from the actual experts, the people who have the lived experience, to these sort of fake experts, really. And at the same time, the kind of loss of relation. Like, is the amount of attention paid to the supposed problem or to the real problem in tune with, or does it stand in a relationship to the actual prevalence of this problem, right? Are these commensurate at all? And in a moral panic, no, they kind of constitutively slide apart.
Yeah.
And that is to say that every time you point out something's a moral panic, people will, well, what do you make of this case? Isn't that real? And you're like, yeah, that's not the point here, right? Like, we can have a moral panic about child abductions, and that's not to say that there aren't child abductions, that they aren't terrible, right? But that's, I think, why Cohen thought of it as a moral panic.
Yeah.
In that, basically, if you say, look, this is horrible, but there's not that many of these, people say, you don't take this seriously. You do not take our pain seriously. You do not take our fear seriously. And so, well, yes, I am. But at the same time, I'm saying there's a problem here. There's a disjuncture here between the spread of a phenomenon and its medial spread. And that is, I thought, very, very clearly what's happening with cancel culture discourses in the countries that I was looking at it in.
So this is a book that is in a lot of ways it's about the internet, right? I don't think that's reductive to say that. No. And it's about, we've gotten so many feeling words out already. It is about the structures of feeling, and also the structures of, also the discursive structures that it provokes and enables, makes possible, what have you. I would guess that in this way, there is a certain continuity between this project and your previous book, What Tech Calls Thinking. And I would also, venture to speculate that spending, the last 10, 12 years on campus in Palo Alto has probably
16.
informed 16.
I know.
Wow.
God damn. I throw up in my mouth a little bit just saying that.
But that spending that much time, at Stanford, on campus in Palo Alto has informed some of the ways in which you've come to write about, I don't have like an elegant term for this, but like internet feelings, right? Internet feelings. So in the book, while you do examine the way in which huge swaths of people become preoccupied by and concerned about quote unquote cancel culture, you're not ratifying the objective existence of cancellation as a phenomenon that ought to be feared. But also, you don't dismiss it out of hand or deny that people have these genuine worries about being quote unquote canceled. So I'd really like to ask you, as someone who's been immersed in this, not only in the American context, but also in the ways that this has become so powerful in the various European contexts that you explore. Why do you think the term cancel culture and this fear of cancellation have become so successful? Like, why is cancellation so sticky as a term, and also like as a fear? I guess I'm just really interested in how you understand these feelings, and some of them you name in the book, but I don't want to limit you to this, but just for the listener, I know you talk a lot about anxieties about not being able to say anything anymore, worries about the narrowing of acceptable political discourse, self-censorship. Yeah. So can we talk about those like internet feelings and how you understand them in this context?
Yeah, my Stanford colleague Angel Christine talks about this as platform drama, and I love that phrase.
Oh, it's so good.
So I think that's a lot of what this is. Of course, like if you had to sort of name the important distinction between the earlier political correctness discourse and cancel culture, it would be the presence of the internet, but specifically social media, right? And I think it's important to note, right, some of that is really inherent in the platforms themselves, right? There is this kind of canard that we're all in our own bubbles now and the internet, blah, blah, blah. But the opposite is the case, really. Twitter makes money by confronting me with the most rebarbative bullshit that I've ever seen so that I'll retweet it and call it rebarbative bullshit, which, allows them to, well, I guess no longer sell ads for like American Airlines, but for like, crypto and, dick pills or whatever, right? So like that is, this idea that these platforms walk us to the line is I think very, very important. And we feel that, right? I mean, it is a structure of affect that we recognize, right? That we were like, whoa, I'm kind of glad I didn't say that. Wow. Right? Or like I
dodged a bullet there.
Or like when you caught at the last second that someone was doing a bit, right? Like this thing where you're like, oh, that's not even real. Fuck. Like I almost fell for it, right? Like, I'm so glad I didn't, right?
Am I quoting Internet Hippo correctly where it's like Twitter's going to have a main character every day and the goal is not to be that main character?
Yeah.
It's like a digitalized there, but for the grace of God, go I kind of feeling. Yeah.
Like I've felt this before. I'm so glad I didn't put it in a tweet, right? So I think that's one thing. Then the other thing that connects it to my earlier book, What Tech Calls Thinking, is this kind of reactionary performative disappointment. That is to say, Twitter is really good at being like, we gave you this beautiful tool and all you guys do is like dick jokes and like, and like trolling and, and horrible memes, right? Like this idea that like we could have had something beautiful, but like we are the ones who fucked it up. I think it's really, really important. And it is a really big part of the carping about cancel culture, right? It does always seem to imagine, at least in this, especially in this European version, but also in the kind of Atlantic version of it here in the United States, like what it could have all been like, right? What a real discourse, what a real debate would look like, right?
Like the Habermas version of Twitter.
Exactly, right? Where you're like,
we got so many nice spheres. We can fit so much regulative reason in these spheres, baby.
Taps his platform. Yeah, that's right. I think there's a really, and I mean, what's interesting about it is there are moments when in sort of cancel culture texts where you can sort of tell that someone is like, oh, and then, the internet trolls came out and came after this person. And you look at the actual tweets and you're like, no, this is a debate. This person said one thing and these people said, no, that's wrong. What the vocabulary of cancel culture and cancellation is supposed to do here is actually invalidate people having a debate, just a debate you didn't like, or like a debate you thought like you didn't win, right? And so there is this kind of weird way in which it becomes a way to pathologize internet discourse. And that's why it is important that that cancel culture is a description of Twitter and of Tumblr and of social media more generally that has succeeded in, well, print journalism is putting it too widely, in legacy media, right? Often it does live online, but someone is still putting out a paper product. There's a printing press somewhere in the building, right? And I think that's really, really important. It's a way for them to kind of perform disappointment about our new digital public sphere. At the same time, I think it has a lot of its purchase, as you point out, in these kinds of feelings that we all share, right? How easy is it to lose my job over something I said on Twitter, right? I will not ever tell you that fear is irrational. Like I get it.
Yeah.
At the same time, it is very noticeable that the vast majority of cancel culture texts then don't say, well, why was it so easy to fire this person? They'll say, why was it so easy to get mad at them online? It's like, have you met online?
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's what people do, right? People take the context collapse is a real thing. It's going to happen to you, right? Someone this morning got mad at me for something I said, and I'm just like, I'm not going to engage, right? Like, it's the name of the game, right? We're thousands of miles apart. There are language barriers. People communicate in English who probably shouldn't, frankly. Not to cancel anyone, but like just if you're not that comfortable in language, it can be hard to detect satire and just like don't try. But that being said, right, like it's very interesting where the cancel culture, right? The culture is in there for a reason. Why the cancel culture discourse sort of ends up yelling about people yelling, right? As opposed to being like, well, why is yelling on the internet so easily transmissible into a job loss?
Yeah.
That seems to me the interesting question. And the final thing I'll say is that like, I mean it when I say worrying about cancel culture tends to be yelling about yelling. Why is everyone getting so upset? Based on these two things that this person said, says a man getting upset about a thing based on two things he just read, right? And you're like, these are the two things, these are two sides of the same coin. These are both ways of relating to particular triggers that are actually structurally quite homologous. And what the cancel culture framing allows people to do is not recognize that. Just sort of say, well, no, I am here defending the Habermasian ideal or the legacy of the Enlightenment or the esprit of Voltaire. What these kids are doing is a spirit of censorship and really kind of like Maoist China, if you think about it, right? That is the magic of it. It doesn't, you don't have to face the fact that like that person got mad at that instructor based on one thing they said. And then I got mad at that person based on the one thing they said, right? Like we are the same, right? Like it's the Spider-Man meme, right? Like you're just pointing at two identical Spider-Men. But if we frame it as cancel culture, one of us doesn't have to do that.
What I love too about this, part of what I think your analysis really clarifies is this way in which like cancel culture is understood to be, well, as you state repeatedly in the book, like you deploy this in an injunction that I find very helpful for approaching other things too. Like when we watch like a film or like who are we asked to identify with, right? The complaint about the cancel culture is always from the perspective victim of speech that has offended some other.
Right.
It's never from the position of the other who has been offended, which, is addedly sort of overdetermined in its sort of perversity insofar as that, the others in question, whence this phrase cancel culture, exemplarily Black Twitter, right? In other words, like part of that sort of, and here I use the settler pun kind of deliberately, like the circling of the wagons that's implied in cancel culture is also a type of class solidarity, or it's like an idea of like, I could say something that could offend those people, and you, as a part of an us, i.e. people like me, should damn well be afraid about that because they could come for you too. And in that way, like, it's so overcoated with all the racialized gatekeeping and all this sort of minimization and sort of patronage networks that we're so familiar with. But it also seems to like, at a particularly kind of hypertrophied point, do something very perverse about siloing away this question of like the material world that leads to people losing their jobs in the specific case, but also more in general, right? Like the idea that losing more than their jobs too, by which I mean, I agree with you. People can get fired for saying, well, fuck, like we know people, guests of this show, Stephen Thrasher, right? Whose advocacy has been very, I think, righteous and whatnot, have faced consequences far more severe than any of the people who like signed the Harper's letter have, right? But there is this way in which the anxiety underscores like this, or what it postulates as the most urgent threat containing in like nucleus the potential downfall of democracy and civil society itself. Professional consequences for a fairly limited cadre of people over and against, and this is, I think, a thing that has really been driven home over the past 4 years, like the sheer disposability and contingency and cheapness of life for everybody, but also for some people above all, more so than others. And I couldn't help but like reading these, thinking during some of our many bouts with COVID, right? Just reading stuff about people being afraid to share their opinions in public, and they're not, I'm a comedian who can't go to kids. These Zoomers are not laughing at like my jokes about like what's the deal with cordless phones. Like
your Lewinsky jokes are not landing in 2024.
Exactly, and meanwhile, like that's really bad for Jerry Seinfeld, but also like there are people who are going to public events who are not going to public events who are dying of COVID, right? Like there's an entire population of 1 million Americans has been like literally canceled by being determined to be just sort of life, not like life unworthy of living, but life unworthy of, being sustained by a social safety net or other people's inconveniences any further. And on that level, there's something very comforting.
Oh yeah, about discourse, about thinking that the stakes are fundamentally are exactly
the real mass graves will be of careers of journalists like mine, not the one that they're digging at Rikers right now. And it also then follows and makes kind of perfect sense that the threat put onto the other that the other represents it becomes like almost literally lethal, right?
Yeah.
They're going to destroy me.
Yeah, exactly. I think that what you're pointing to is that there are as squishy as the word cancel culture is, there are clear rules of who can do it and who can't, right?
Yeah.
It tends to be the young, the woke, trans people seem to be very capable of it in the conservative imagination. And there are people who kind of don't, right? Like, there are people who don't have to ask themselves, are we doing cancel culture right now? They tend to be older, they tend to be established, they tend to be, sort of higher up in hierarchies. And really what it is, it's not necessarily just about who matters. It's about who's the main character.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, one good example is self-censorship, right? Like, we keep getting these kinds of studies and these kinds of discourses about self-censorship. And the idea is like, what would happen to me if I said the N-word, right? So that means I, in that example, am white, right? Like, otherwise I could, absolutely say it. But it matters only, the imagined censoree or person censoring themselves is white.
Yeah.
The idea that, racial, ethnic, religious, or sexual and gender minorities in the United States censor themselves all the time by like not foregrounding that they have a same-sex partner. To pick a random example, right? That doesn't fall under this kind of censorship, right? Like, what it is an opinion. Like, what if I have an opinion about gay people? What if I'm gay, right? Like, it very cleverly kind of gives us a sense of, well, who matters, right? I mean, like, these are liberal publications. They're not going to say these people, like, that isn't real, but they're like, it doesn't get captured by cancel culture, right?
Yeah.
A person who is African American, wears dreads and thinks that they're being not promoted at work is never going to say, oh, that's cancel culture, right? They may say many things. They may be like, this might be racism, this might be discrimination. I don't feel really I belong here. I don't feel very welcome here. It would be very, very unlikely that they reach for the vocabulary of cancellation and cancel culture, right? Whereas the person, there is literally an example of cancel culture in Switzerland, which concerned a white reggae band uninvited from a club for wearing dreadlocks. So like, yeah, exactly. Like, aren't the real tribunals the ones that disinvited reggae bands from punk clubs in Zurich for wearing white guy dreads? Right? Like, it's just very telling of where we are asked to place our sympathy and our attention in this.
Yeah. And I think, I don't know if this is a word you use or if it's just one that I was kind of mulling as I was, sitting, I read your book a little while ago, but I've been, kind of possibly because I work on a college campus, like, it's been really in my head as I've been, kind of thinking about the campus, my campus, the reality of it for me, the conversations that happen, the ways that isn't contiguous with the various ways in which you describe it being imagined. But the word that I'm thinking about is misdirection. And I think that you're showing the way that the centering not only the use of the language of cancel culture, but the centering of that fear as being so crucial, right? And what you're pointing out here as like the unstated default subject position of the person who has that fear. I mean, I think so often about, like the like quote unquote like free speech conversations. And like, there's this, it's so, I have never once, I think, except in like a grant proposal or like some other bureaucratic language, non-ironically used the phrase, the free and lively exchange of ideas. Because like, let's just see, like, what is that line that I always misquote from Nietzsche, Patrick? Something, and everything is permitted.
Nothing is true.
Oh yeah, nothing is true and everything is permitted. But it's the everything that is permitted part that's, that I think is so important here. And so much of what we're talking about is just like, and what you're doing when you're situating the resurgence of cancel culture as, a repetition of political correctness post Me Too, and in the era of Black Lives Matter, is saying like a lot of this worry about, am I going to say the wrong thing in public? Do I need to self-censor? Is this fear, is the scope of what can be said, is that has that
narrower.
Everybody actually knows those. Like, what that just means is I can't be racist in public anymore, and I resent that. Right. You know, so in the campus context, like, I've had tons of conversations with folks that are like, oh, you actually set like ground rules. And I'm like, yeah, you know, I'll say you actually can't be like racist or misogynist or transphobic in my class. Like, I got no problem. And they're like, don't you think that really impedes the free and lively exchange of ideas? And I'm like, well, for who? For who?
Yeah.
You know, do we really need to have a conversation about like, but like, hear me out. What if women are just dumber and worse than men and don't deserve rights? Like,
hashtag important debates. Yeah.
It's so, I
got to hear both sides.
I found myself like reading the book that was so like, I found myself drawing connections to like trying to like account for it in by an analogy to like, this is like an account of like the dream work, right? The processes by which like this, the day's residues of anxieties are
love this,
transmuted into this kind of like, well, essentially an exculpatory dream that's all about you, where you get to have things both ways or any possible way, right? Like, and the other can be all powerful, but also easily vanquished. And you can be, you know, 100% good, but also and responsible for all the things that are great, but also maligned. And it just, it read about like a whole series of quintessentially reactive, but also constructive social defense mechanisms or ways of metabolizing or refusing to metabolize demographic change, mortality rates increasing, but also just like our individual condition of vulnerability to one another. And in a way in which like these conversations get so out ahead or like are so, again, hypertrophied, right? And also neotenic, like they appeal to us as like both children, but also as like they appeal to these sort of like absurd institutions where it's like, I'm thinking, how do I say this? Like there's a whole series of moves such that the question becomes people of good faith and reason, right? Or like, or possibly like decent moral impulses have to entertain the question of, I don't know, like, do we want to live into a society where people won't have Alan Dershowitz over for dinner? Right. Right. Or could we possibly, do you think Matt Taibbi should be living on the streets and not have a job? And first off, let's just stipulate, Former's going to get so invited to a lot of dinners, you know, maybe not on Martha's Vineyard, but he's still going to get them. And Matt Taibbi's perfectly fine because of intergenerational wealth and because he'll do anything and whatever. And this whole subject phenomenon, fuck him. The point is, they're both fine, right? They're not facing that.
Yeah.
But we have that conversation, and the people doing this defense appeal to this kind of social principle of like, why would you make these people suffer so much? It's so much Sturm und Drang that like what's the simply straightforward, non sort of pathological thing to say, which I feel is almost unsayable, which is just like, I feel like nobody should live on the streets. And no matter how bad your job is, you're bad at your job, or like, well, maybe you lose the job, but that shouldn't be.
You should still get to, you know,
live, right? Like your opinions may be terrible, and people should tell you to fuck off when they see you,
right? But that shouldn't mean you lose your health care.
But that also doesn't mean. But instead, we're like, no, you are obligated to pay for their Substack. How dare you? Right? There's some sort of like.
I was going to make a Substack joke too.
Yeah, it does more than just erase the obvious questions of, well. What it does is, I'll use the vocabulary that you use in the book, and hopefully with some precision on my part, like it presents as a question of extreme urgency and supposedly universal relevance, what is actually a fairly frivolous concern for a very particular variety of cases, precisely so that we don't have to think about contingent and far too depressing and ubiquitous circumstances of vulnerability, precarity, and
what we all owe to each other potentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yes,
which is precisely why cancel culture stories tend to be in media and academia, where so many people are, you know, living paycheck to paycheck or not even, right, and not, let's say, in big law firms, right? Like this is very much a story of contingent labor, except that it's about Alan Dershowitz, not about the the lecturer that wasn't invited to come back because he was spotted at that one protest or whatever. I also I love the way you're putting that. And one way I would think about it is like it's about a lot of it is about the feeling behind the feeling, right? There's a kind of there's this kind of there's this kind of fixation on loss, right? Because in some way, probably these people didn't just kind of like drop, horrible racist epithets at faculty meeting like 40 years. I mean, maybe they do it. I guess I didn't go, but like,
I'm sure you could still read the minutes, Adrian.
Yeah, exactly. Jesus Christ. That is not what they are like, for the record.
I don't think,
yeah. There's a weirdly specific thing. But I guess what I was going to say is like there is an element here of an imagined kind of moment of a subject that could speak its mind with perfect freedom. And like there may have been a moment when like some white men felt that way, but probably not that many, frankly. And it's just about this fantasy, right? And often this kind of drama of this kind of public staging of melancholy, really, that's happening there. I'll give two examples. One is the kind of language wars around foodstuffs in some of Europe, where I show in the book that like these are 30 years old. For 30 years, they're still going on about how you can't say this thing anymore. Like first of, you wrote it. Second of, like in 2023, and second of, like people have been belly aching about how you can't say this word since like the 90s. Like it is almost as old as I am, right? And then a second example of this is, and I will instrumentalize or draft my dearly departed grandma into this, who would for a long time was an inveterate user of the minor N word. So not I don't want to give the impression that she was like full KKK, but like, the other one. And whenever she knew that her grandchildren hated this and were like, please stop. And every time she'd say it, she'd say, oh, whatever they want to be called now. And it's like, Grandma, you lived in the United States in 1963. Surely you didn't use this word then. So like, what they, quote unquote, have asked you to do, they've asked for most of your adult life. You've had a half century to adjust to this language change. You've learned what a VCR is, what a, what a catalytic converter is, what the internet is in the meantime. You learned all that. Kind of feels like you didn't want to learn this one. And it kind of feels like it's doing some kind of work for you that you can stage your resistance, your recalcitrance, your utter shock and surprise at an imagined, right? Like she didn't know any Black people. Like she lived in rural little town of Germany, right? Like she, but like she imagined us being offended or someone being offended.
Yeah.
And there's something about the recalcitrance here that is sort of feels spectacular, it feels dramatic. As you say, she's metabolizing something, but something that's not getting metabolized.
I mean, like the example of your grandmother is making me think about how, like, on the one hand, particularly with like people who have the prominence of having a platform, right, and then use the platform to talk about how they're being deplatformed, right? The people who are like, they keep on sending cancel squads after me, but like they keep sending shooters, but I'm just too good, right? I'm the uncancelable man, right? There is some element of that, which is, I mean, it's of course gargantually narcissistic, but it also has this element that codes of like, well, I got here.
Yeah.
I'm going to flex it because I can, but also I got here. Is this all there is? So I got to do something to prove that I matter.
Yeah.
And so I'll poke and then prove it to prove my point. And like, it's always easier to provoke people to prove whatever point it is you think you were going to make than it is to learn something new. And that I think is contemptible. Right. But I also do think at the same time, and this is also, I'm getting at the sadness of it, like this kind of like where it's, I have encountered people who like clearly they're trying to get some sort of rise out of other people or like, I'm this old. I should at least be allowed to vent my malice, right?
Yeah.
Or make other people fucking deal with this thing, right? Or I didn't get mine. Someone's getting away with something. Like those are things that are, I think, cultivated without excusing any of like the racism or the ways that this place, like
you're being descriptive.
Yeah,
I get it. Not normative.
Those events. In the cases of just like human beings who are like, I'm afraid my children are going to cancel me, right? Obviously, yes, fix their fix their views. And, like, I'm not saying like send them re-education camps, but maybe we send them re-education camps. I don't really know. The point is like, it's not really about the views so much as it is like, it's like, I want to be, tell me that my views matter, or tell me that I'm a person who has views that could matter, and that the world is not simply moving on from me. And I think that's right. I feel like there aren't, I feel like we could do better. I don't know who the we is here, but like, I feel like at some point someone could have done better at being like, I'd love to listen to the things you say, but also regulate the things that are terrible when they come out of their mouth. I don't know. I
mean, I think there's something to that. And I think that, so I don't think that way, I must admit, about people who present themselves as prominent cancel victims, but I do think that's why it catches on. That you guys have already alluded to that.
Which is more interesting in some way.
Yeah, exactly. I think that it comes out of a deeply admirable human impulse. I do not think that there are obviously reactionary ogres who consume a lot of these cancel culture texts and build their worldviews out them. And then there are absolutely lovely people who just think that people should be nice to each other. And I'm like, well, no argument there. That seems preferable than the alternative. I do think it's kind of worth thinking about also when we think about self-censorship. I have one of the things that I pointed out in the book is that very clearly these things sort of catch on in broader audiences when they catch on more easily if like this idea that there is a new wave of censorship when people have a recent memory of things that they kind of wanted to say but didn't get to. And this can be kind of very very retrograde. So I point out that, for instance, a lot of this early kind of or this resurgence in concern with political correctness, identity politics, and then later cancel culture, and now le wokeisme in France is all about the gay marriage debate, where people just sort of felt they couldn't be properly homophobic, which, like, sorry, also you were, so like you managed to get it in, so good job there, French people. But but some of them I think are more nonpartisan, frankly. So one thing I really found when touring with the German book in 2022 is that a bunch of people were like, well, what do you make of COVID? And I'm like, what? I'm like, well, I feel like all these people got canceled for speaking out about COVID. And I'm like who? Like RFK Jr.? Like, what are you talking about, right? And I think what it was is that there are very few examples of people really kind of not getting to say their piece about COVID. If anything, if you look at newspapers from the time, people were allowed to say some pretty crazy shit.
Yeah.
But of course, what we all shared at the time was that on a matter of utmost existential importance, how to deal with a deadly disease, we differed even with friends that we agreed with on most things.
Yep.
And they did stuff that either sounded too cautious or not cautious enough. That sounded, censorious or not censorious enough. That sounded permissive or too permissive or not permissive enough. And that we very pointedly didn't say anything. We kind of just, I remember that. I remember not pointing out that, you say you've been perfectly safe. And then I keep seeing people walking behind you in your Zoom. And I'm like, that feels like those two things, at least in my understanding, don't go together. But like we all suffered sort of side by side with one another, and no one's COVID prevention techniques, I think, were exactly the other person's. And so there was always an element of unspeakability, of things that we couldn't say. And that to me is like, that is part of the tragedy of that historic moment that we'll have to at some point historically grapple with. I don't feel like doing it now because it's depressing as shit, but I think we have to. And it's very clearly like that allowed for a kind of receptivity, or for an intensified receptivity to the idea that, you can't say anything anymore, because there really you couldn't. It was like, what were you going to do? Like provoke a big family row and then like not go? You already bought the tickets. So you were just like, you showed up and like crossed your fingers and were like, these people are idiots, right? And didn't say that either, right? You were not like, you guys are idiots. You just said, okay, well, just hope that we all get lucky here with your bonkers, quote unquote precautions, right? I think that so it can come from very, very understandable places, but it is what makes these things kind of catch on.
I think a thread that I found myself following, particularly as the book wound to a close, was this notion of virality or the contagion effect of cancel culture. And I think we've already addressed kind of how that, is poetically or impoetically rhymes with the erasure of actual, human disposability that the COVID sort of pandemic or now endemic circumstances has really ratified. But there was something about, like, how do I say this? Like, I find myself thinking about those bits where Freud himself will say, like, that we betray ourselves in speech, right? Or that simply moving our lips is already somehow saying more than we would want to, right? Yeah. Or even the idea of, like, this is core to any psychoanalytic notion of subjectivity. We slip. They're parapraxes, right? They're famously so. Shout out Parapraxis Magazine, right? And on that level, like, we are always aware that we could say something
that we could air,
right? That we could say something horrible, or that something horrible almost could speak us.
Yes.
Right.
Yes,
which
is a good
is,
way to put it. Yeah.
I think, an experience that is properly horrifying in a lot of ways. That, however, seems like both on the one hand, a universal existential human condition, and on the other hand, something that is reflective of contingent, but also really world historical developments in terms of how we communicate and in terms of how we are vulnerable to one another. But the contemplating both those things is untenable or goes against the bandwidth limitations of a discourse that would much rather talk about how, no, actually, the minor increase of distress or the experience of distress of people who are experiencing a very particular type of distress vis-a-vis their, as you describe it, affirmative relationship to the status quo power structure, should trump the expressions of distress made by people and, like, actual human visible suffering made by people who are at the receiving end of that oppressive structure and who are constantly. It's like, to put, like, very bluntly, to go back to one of these flipping the script examples, we don't call it self-censorship or write a letter to Harper's about it when people feel compelled to call a police officer sir when they get pulled over.
Yeah.
Or are afraid to ask why they were, or if they're being detained. And there's something about the erasure of these all too real and fucked up differentials of vulnerability in favor of a mystified focus on, like, well, we could always misspeak, and we are always too sensitive, and someone else is always, quote unquote, too sensitive, but there are category confusions happening there, and it's being perpetuated, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think and of course, there's also kind of the pop Freudianism of this discourse kind of drops in and out, right? Like, there are moments when a subject totally ignorant of repression is imagined, right? Where we just blurt out everything that pops into our mind, right? Which is a phantasm, very clearly, right? And then there are others when it's being recognized that, like, yes, some censorship, some intervention is how we form an ego and how we are no longer 2 years old and, showing our poop to our parents, right? Like, that's what we call being a person, right? And I think that the way you talked about it earlier, where you said sort of like that it's intergenerational, this discourse, but it's also kind of with you almost have two ages at the same time, right? There's an infantile element and a senescent element, sort of squished together in these gestures, and they kind of don't ever bother to decide where they really want to fall. I think that's really important. At the same time, I think the state, actual repressive apparatuses, obviously kind of introduce a third element to this, which is to say that, right, like the famous phrase, like, oh, one wrong word can lead to X, Y, and Z. It's like, well, there are situations in which one wrong word in our society really is, as you say, like, said to a policeman, can be absolutely calamitous in a way that, frankly, no racial epithet you were to utter, while stroking out during a lecture or something like that, could ever be, right? And it does feel like it kind of the discourse draws a very, very creates a very specific theater of self-censorship and repression, and it's as interesting what's in the frame as what it leaves out.
Adrian, thank you so much for talking with us today. The book is so fantastic. Could not recommend it
so much.
More highly. Go out and buy it. Not you, Adrian. You already have it. Listeners, go out and buy it.
I have a few copies here, yeah.
You might have a couple in German, in English.
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell our listeners where they might, for instance, hear you on your own podcast about upcoming appearances, other writing, generally other ways for our listeners to get more Adrian Daub?
Yeah, if this hasn't totally turned you off of Adrian Daub, you can find me on Substack. I'm adriandaub.substack.com. I write about some of the issues we're talking about today, but also some other weird shit like cars. I write a lot about cars. I will have a couple of pieces coming out in various media. I'm basically kind of deciding to do a couple of deep dives into specific controversies. I do feel like I didn't get to do that in the book quite as much, but I did do the research for a lot of them. And so I'm now sort of writing up my thoughts and sort of trying to also like maybe detect some of the more dissonant or discordant aspects of this panic, right? Like the book is 200 pages, so it's really meant to kind of try to be pretty efficient. And here I kind of want to give myself time with these anecdotes, with these stories, with these locations, and to really think through how that particular moment, this particular kerfuffle, the particular kind of fight that then got sort of codified as cancel culture, how it really worked, and to what extent the real story kind of complicates our understanding of what we're really debating about here. So that's unfortunately none of these I can name as of yet.
That's okay. If you send them to me if they appear before this episode, I'll put them in the show notes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you again for talking with me. Really a dream come true.
Same.
Such a pleasure, Adrian.
Delightful, really.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Ordinary Unhappiness. Our podcast is entirely supported by our wonderful Patreon community, which is how we can keep the podcast going and also keep it ad-free for all of our listeners. If you would like to support the show and also get 2 additional Patreon episodes per month, please come over and find us at patreon.com/ordinary unhappiness. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Adrian Daub. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.